Hello. Hello. We're about to start the Electrification and a Just Energy Transition panel in a few minutes. We're actually starting right now. So if y'all wanted to come in and take a seat and have a listen, we'd sure appreciate it. Looking forward to touching on a lot of subjects today. My name is John Shieber. I am an editor and venture partner with Footprint Coalition. It's Robert Downey Jr.'s climate-focused initiative. We have a nonprofit, we have a venture fund, and a media company. And we are working to enable electrification and a just energy transition through our investment activities and everything else that we're doing. To my immediate left is Miguel Sangalang. He's the executive director of LA Lights. To his left is Ahmad Eldridge, the director of climate innovations at JFF, Jobs for the Future. And he's also the co-founder of Include Ventures, a diversity-focused investment fund that does all sorts of amazing stuff and things. And finally, last but not least, is Nathaniel Smith, who is not the mayor of Miami-Dade County.
I am not.
But you know, maybe fingers crossed, one day.
No.
He is, however, the executive director for the Partnership for Southern Equity. So it's a pretty incredible panel we have, and it's an incredibly important topic to be chatting about. So I'm just going to jump right in. And I think when I think about the electrification and just energy transition, I think there are probably like four different ways, well, at least four different ways to talk about it. That's the infrastructure that's needed to create it, the policies that need to be developed to support it, the people who are going to be building it, and the innovations that are going to enable it. And we're going to try and touch on all four of those things on this panel today. And we're going to jump right in and get started with infrastructure. So, Miguel, as the executive director of LA Lights, you are responsible for maintaining the city's 223,000 lights. That's a lot of lights. But it's doing a lot more than that now. Y'all have a number of initiatives underway to sort of take that embedded infrastructure and turn it into something that can be an engine for a just energy transition. I'd love to hear from you how y'all are leveraging that infrastructure and sort of what y'all are doing around this idea of a just transition and the infrastructure that's going to support that.
Sure, and good morning, everybody. Or I think it's still morning from the time. Again, Miguel Sangalang, I head LA Lights. We have, as was mentioned by John, 220,000 plus street lights throughout the city of Los Angeles. They're all kind of spread throughout. I'd probably say that LA has a little bit of an affinity towards them. We have, displays like at our county museum, the urban lights display that shows it's one of the most Instagram spots in the city, right? So we have other things like Vermonica we've had in many different kind of historical things. So LA actually really likes the streetlights. But the piece that I wanted to say about that is it's not only the light itself, and that's what John was getting at, right? Beneath that, what connects it is a system, a network of about 9,000 miles of conduit. I have 27,000 miles of copper wire that connect all of it, make sure it's there. So I actually have three things that are highly important, not just the light itself. I have poles, pipes, and power. Lots of assets with great value, especially given its place in the right of way. So ever since that we switched out from high intensity discharge going into LED lights, we've focused on technology. There's never going to be a time where I buy anything that does not have a semiconductor in it, right? Unless it's some of those basic things. So from there, we've been branching out. We've used air quality sensors in partnerships with things that we call predicting the air we breathe. That's using NASA satellite information, local universities, and then our streetlight sensors, even schools, to try and mash up the data and get some insights from that. For local air quality, I mean, very important for Los Angeles, given wildfires or other situations. We're using it for EV chargers. We have one of the largest municipal public deployments on the right of way. We also have other advents where we're using it for greater public safety, increasing lighting, all these things. So I think the possibilities by having that infrastructure, and this is where I think building out that infrastructure, maintaining it. If you don't maintain it, it eventually becomes bane. Building it out, maintaining it, and making sure it's in the places that it needs to be will matter. because without some of this infrastructure there, how will some of these places, if you look at multifamily units in LA, which will have eventually EVs in it once they start getting to the secondary market, important for them to have possibilities for charging and all that. So I'll stop there. There's a lot of other people with
There's a lot to dig into,
anyway.
but we're going to get to it in a second. Or we're going to talk more about it. But the other piece of that is trying to have the right policies that can enable the kind of investment into this infrastructure that already exists. And I was really hoping that, Nathaniel, you could talk a little bit about some of what y'all are doing on the policy side to really drive those opportunities.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about that. I think the first thing that we have to acknowledge, and again, I'm Nathaniel Smith. I lead an organization called the Partnership for Southern Equity. We're focused on realizing a new Southern agenda for racial equity in the American South. We're based in Atlanta and also a multi-issue organization, and energy equity is a primary area in which we work in. And so when we talk about the just transition, the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that the just transition will not happen by itself.
Yep.
Right? That just because people have good intentions, we all know the saying about what is paved because of good intention, the road to hell, right? So you have to make sure that the civic infrastructure, right, is in place to ensure that community voices and communities are engaged in ways that will ensure that their values around the energy transition are fully realized, right? And so a lot of people talk about what they call energy democracy, right? How can we make sure that the voices of communities that are affected by the most because of the challenges that we face around energy are actually at the table shaping policy and are positioned in a way to bring solutions to the table. And so whether it be our Just Energy Academy, where we have different leaders from around the South who attend our leadership development programs. Actually, we have one in the audience right now. If you don't raise your hand, who's a recent graduate of our Just Energy Academy, where leaders from around the South are engaged in learning about a just energy transition, to the work that we do engaging our Public Service Commission, educating communities about what the Public Service Commission is and working to ensure that they're engaged and involved in that, to working with the city of Atlanta around developing their just transition strategy in ways that is centered in equity, to really working to really shape not only from our perspective what is critical and important, but to also make sure that the community, the individuals that are being affected the most are not just at the table, because being at the table is not enough, right? We have to make sure that they're positioned in a way to bring solutions and, when necessary, fight, right, for the type of policies they need to ensure that the type of transition that we want and want to realize is equitable and not just replacing one extractive economy with another.
Right. And I think this actually flows very nicely into the work that Taj is doing as well, which is not just getting people a seat at the table to have the discussion around policy, but getting a seat at the table to reap the benefits of this energy transition that's going to be occurring. And Taj, if you want to talk about sort of the jobs work that y'all are doing, I'd love to have the folks hear a little bit about that.
Thanks, John. Well, first of all, I have to say thank you for the y'alls, because this son of Texas is loving it. But, Nathaniel is right, and we're seeing this idea is that the people who are most impacted have to also be part of the solution. And for me, this idea of climate change, this idea about environmentalism is more than just about saying that the Earth is going to stop. We're stopping global warming. It's really threefold. It is a public health issue. So we've seen a lot of different people who are impacted from a public health standpoint about environmental racism, climate racism as well. It's an economic issue because there's job creation, and it's a way to reduce the racial wealth gap that we have in this country with the jobs that are being created. What John is alluding to is that Ares, the venture capital fund or private equity fund, their foundation put $25 million to do two things: to create 25,000 new jobs in the climate resilient green economy, and then number two, to make sure that 100,000 more people are aware of these jobs. So what that means is having these conversations about what we're talking about in places other than here, right? Because all of the folks here, we kind of know about these things. But what this means is that having these conversations in communities, having these conversations on radio stations, having these conversations in areas to where the people who have not heard about these opportunities but are impacted by it can take a part of that. The other thing I think is really interesting about this too, John, is that We're talking about an equitable life in this idea of diversity. So not just people with PhDs like me, but not just people who have BAs or college degrees, but we're also talking about people who may have associate's degrees in community colleges. We're also talking about people who don't have degrees from a higher education, and they're participating in earn and learn opportunities. And so when we look at things like Charger Help, which is an LA-based company focusing on EVs and EV repair, and how they're focusing on the job creation for not just those individuals who, like I mentioned, but also returning citizens to the space. I think it's going to be interesting, and I think it's an opportunity for us to use the just transition to really build us from an economic standpoint as well.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I guess one question that I have, as we think about the kind of opportunity sets that are going to enable this this sort of improvement in health, in wealth, and the environment that comes from transitioning to a more sustainable and renewable future. When you think about where the rubber is hitting the road for LA Light, what are y'all going to be focusing on in the near term, and sort of what are y'all's longer term thoughts around, do you focus on the pollution detection so that you can have the data to even talk about rectifying problems in frontline and fence line communities? I'm sorry, I'm picking on you, man, but are you looking at electrification as sort of the next near-term thing? I know y'all have the partnership with Flow that's doing the chargers off of light poles themselves, right? So you can do EV charging off of the the light pole. So what is the near-term sort of objective for y'all?
Yeah, and don't worry, government officials are very used to public comment, so we'll deal with it. I think for us, there's a couple things, and I talked about infrastructure and its placement. If you're using the 5 ways, I was writing this down earlier, but like we're really focused on who, where, and how for some of the things that we're doing it, right? We already all agree on sustainability, resiliency. Equity is like some of these larger goals, but how do you get there? Where are you going to do it? Who's going to be involved? Those are things that I think we need to define more. For us on the infrastructure component, I think it's a really, really fascinating conversation. One, just because there's going to be money to be had, but two, there's an entire design thing that's going to be included, right? So just think of energy right now. And, predominantly most systems built goes from power plant, goes to transmission, goes to your home, goes to your business. Maybe we take it in batteries. More and more we now have phones, right? Before that, though, we use propane, go cook, Now we have all these things that are electrified, requiring electricity, technology that's involved, right? And we're going to have to try and figure out how to actually bring that to the end user. That's going to be a completely different conversation. You're looking at Taiwan with like battery charger swap out capabilities for scooters. Some people that hack Priuses into what are they called? The canter, whatever, the power lines in the air for trains and all that. Like, there's a whole new delivery system that we have to think about. This is where LA Lights is involved. We're really close to the end user, and we care about two things there: the connectivity and the electricity, both of which are going to be very important for how we apply these technologies that are going to be brought to bear. The other piece of that is how do we actually dialogue? How do we create it to be much more inclusive? Because we're probably going to design it wrong ourselves, right? And then how do we actually involve people into those jobs? But we can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, and Judd, may I add? I think what I love
Add whatever you want. The more y'all talk, the less I have to talk, the better I feel about this.
But I want the community to think about this as well. What Miguel is saying is that we often talk about diversity in two binary areas: racial diversity, which is definitely needed, and gender diversity. I want you to think about this third piece of that goes along to what he's saying is geographic diversity. There's an opportunity for us to really kind of impact different communities, rural communities. We're talking about communities that may have food deserts, where I grew up at. And so I think that where he's talking about, and the thing that I'm loving about it, is that we're not solving the climate crisis in a silo. We're taking ideas from other countries. He just mentioned the Philippines and some other areas, and we can implement that in other areas as well. The same thing here that's going to the other area also. When the pandemic hit, it didn't matter what you were doing. It didn't matter where you were at. All of us in this whole global community were impacted. The same thing is going to happen on the climate side. Right. And so for me, the solutions have to be global as well.
Right. Nathaniel, yeah. Well, I wanted to talk about the engaging the community aspect because I think that's really important and one that y'all are working to address directly. But I also wanted to talk about the education piece too, because some of this stuff is really arcane, right? It's pretty in the weeds. And you mentioned that you were doing some work with the Public Service Commission in Atlanta. In Georgia, and there was actually a recent ruling that changed the way the Public Service Commission is structured in Georgia to address some of the historic racism that was present in the panel in the commission. I was wondering if you could talk about that, why that's important, and how y'all are trying to reach out to communities to get them educated, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible because I think a lot of times when we talk about educating frontline communities about our just transition, our clean energy future, we forget that there is a lot of educating that we have to do with people that are in positions of influence and power, right? So our current economy primarily looks at communities of color as labor or consumers. They don't look at them as makers or key components to our economy in the future. Most of the time, they look at communities of color as liabilities and not assets, right? So there's a lot of education that has to happen in order to elevate people's consciousness around where will the talent and genius come from in the 21st century. So, for example, right now we're working with Senator Sonia Halpern in Georgia around this whole statewide conversation about the role of HBCUs in realizing a more inclusive economy for our state. And one of the key things that we're looking at and trying to lift up is the importance that HBCUs must play in advancing towards a clean energy transition. We're working, for example, with the Atlanta University Center around developing a resilience hub, which will have microgrid technology and battery technology and be leveraged as a way to not only be a workforce development opportunity, but also help to create a cleaner HBCU infrastructure, right, in the state. So for us, it's really about making sure that the policymakers are reintroduced to communities of color and communities that have been disinvested in, while at the same time working to make sure that the policymakers, yes, are educated, but also understand and feel the civic influence of frontline communities who have been positioned to speak out and speak up. You know, you mentioned a key ruling that just happened recently with our Public Service Commission that it violated civil rights issues because it was a statewide election. We have one of the few public service commissions that are elected. So now we finally have an opportunity to have someone, hopefully, that is a part of the Public Service Commission that is not a white male. That is not something that we've had before. But in order for us to seize that moment, we have to make sure that all sides are educated to not just see it as a win-lose, but a win-win for everyone in the state.
How much of that is the responsibility of the cities themselves to reach out into these communities and provide that kind of education?
I mean, I think it's really important, but I also think that, and we've learned this through our work with President Biden's Justice 40 executive order, that you have to have these on-ramps that are connected to nonprofit organizations, right? It can't just fundamentally be the role of government to not just develop policies and implement them. You have to have partnerships and relationships with nonprofits like the Partnership for Southern Equity and other groups to make sure that the delivery systems, right, of opportunity are connected in ways. So yes, they have a role and responsibility, but they can't be the sole place where engagement lives. They have to partner with organizations that are in the community to ensure that those connections are made in an equitable and inclusive way.
Well,
Yeah, hold on, and let me add though.
wait, no, yeah, go ahead.
You know, I'm a swimmer. I get in, but let me add though. You're right. If you look over their booth over there, there's an article that talks about Danielle Black Power, a company called Black Power, a company called Promise. All these companies coming together to build a coalition of the willing to implement technologies for communities. That's the same thing that needs to happen here, from a standpoint of the nonprofit, the venture capital, the startup companies as well. That's the way in. We can't be where it's like just only, again, in the silos with the people who are providing the solutions.
Right. The other question I'd have around that is, a lot of cities, frankly, don't have a lot of money, right? They're kind of capitally constrained. So are there ways for them to work with an organization like Jobs for the Future and access some of that $25 million that y'all have been given to create educational programs in the public-private partnerships that we heard on the first panel this morning are so critical?
Well, I am giving away some checks with that $25 million. So cities, come holler at your boy. But No, seriously. So one of the things we're going to be doing with this idea with Crest is we're talking about providing these roadmaps for them to develop the future of the workforce. But we also realize, so as we said, is that costs money, right? And so part of this is providing capital to help test this out and implement it, and doing it in 3 ways: upskilling, reskilling, and re-educating. And the whole idea is to ensure that we're talking with the economic development agencies at these cities, we're talking with the universities at these cities, we're talking to the community colleges at these cities, and we're making sure we're preparing the people that are at these cities for the next future jobs and the climate space. One thing I would like to add, John, for me is that, again, I keep mentioning I'm from Texas, and the reason I say that it's important is because in the state of Texas, Houston is doing a fantastic job of really kind of understanding the energy transition, being a former energy space. I grew up in Dallas, and we're a little bit more slower on the Dallas side. But one of the things we're going to be doing here is that we have to change the conversation around climate change. We have to change the conversation around it and not too much talk about the science behind it. And I agree that's important. For me, it's all about economics, and it's about jobs. It's about job creation. And so when we talk about it from that way, we can get away from a lot of the contention, a lot of the political contention, and we can create the next level of jobs for each of these communities and these cities. One of the things I would add that I was really excited about when talking about this idea of rural exposure is the city of Ithaca in New York.
Right.
Block Power expanded and worked with the mayor to electrify a lot of their buildings there. What I loved about that, John, is that people forget Ithaca is part of Appalachia, right? And so that is not New York City. Well, I'm grabbing.
It's a different part of Appalachia.
I'm grabbing.
But I feel like,
but it's not Manhattan. It's not the bridge and tunnel crowd.
I mean, but it is. It's like a very sort of rarefied university town with a very, very high end,
but it's
private Ivy League institution.
But I would
grounds
push
that
back
place.
and say it is a start, because we have the same thing in California, Claremont.
Well, but yeah, I mean, Block Power is working with a number of places. But Miguel, I feel like you had some things that you wanted to say about the funding stuff. So
So just a couple. There's a lot of things to pull threads. I'll just say a couple thoughts to add on to this. With regards to funding, I do think that obviously with the infrastructure bill, other things, there's opportunities, obviously other partnerships too, but cities do sit on a lot of value in the right of way. So I'm just going to underscore that again. Whenever I talk to things, if we only had access to certain things, we can do this or that. Guess who runs access? We do. And we do that, and we do it in a way that we intend to be as fair and equitable as possible, right? So that's just a thing that I think we need to look inside cities again to see where that comes from. The other piece that I would say is, we're talking about just energy transition. Much of this, again, connected to technology, which is also connected to connectivity and the internet. So I don't want to lose the fact that when we go into this, especially with EV chargers where you have apps, other things that people will need to engage on, right? There's another component that has to be thought as part of this. And I think one of the things that really struck me with what Artie said in the plenary earlier was that, you focus on 5 cities, 5 specific American cities, and you can connect 50% of the black population. That blew my mind, right? As a place where there's actual specific focus that can help many different purposes.
And I mean, I think LA can be sort of illustrative there because y'all have really thought about how to use that infrastructure to provide more connectivity. And is that the way that y'all started? Did it start with sort of wired connectivity and then moved into these other ancillary applications?
Actually, the reverse is mostly wireless. So, we have a program, it's called co-location. Essentially, instead of trying to erect other, pieces of infrastructure in the right of way, we prefer just using the same one that's already there, right? Less clutter, kind of helps with everything there. There's already some utilities. So it was actually a push of our Mayor Garcetti to try and like expand technology there, do 5G co-location. So we became one of the first 5G cities in America, several years ago, in 2018, with among others. And that was a push of just, us trying to make sure that we kind of helped along the way spread some of this technology there. Our thought, though, is kind of expanding because, again, when we're talking about some of these things, I'm going to have to upgrade my infrastructure at some point. I'm going to have to start thinking about how it's all engineered. There are things that we could do so we don't have to dig twice. We should focus on trying to be as thoughtful as possible and talking about some of those things that will require change in how we're planning some of the systems that we're building now.
But are there policy changes that needed to be enacted to make that possible in LA, or was it just a poverty of creativity earlier in not just doing that with those networks?
I'd probably say that it was just more of an opportunity that other people saw. I think others saw the value before we did. And we quickly learned that we would have to kind of adapt and think about the infrastructure in a little bit different way.
How important is it to bring in, Nathaniel, how important is it to bring in the communities to the conversations around spending as well? So, like, should the population be educated about the opportunity set that exists in the IRA so that they can push their politicians and representatives to take more action? Is that something that y'all are thinking about, or...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just about that part, but it's also about how do we manage the insatiable appetite for growth and optimization of profit, right, as a primary driver of the clean energy transition. I mean, I've traveled to conferences all around the world, and I hear a lot of people speak about we can make money, we can make money, we can make money. But I think a lot of times people fail to realize that we actually have an opportunity to disrupt the way that our economy has worked in this nation, right, by transitioning towards clean energy. And we have an opportunity to hit the reset button and really begin the process of healing communities that our economy has hurt for now over 400 years through this transition, right? And so with all of that being said, if we are going to affect systems, the systems that perpetuate this, the primary way that you do that is through public policy. And by working to ensure that communities, for example, we have in Georgia a group called the Just Energy Circle, where we have close to 60 organizations that are working with us to influence policy in the state, influence engagement in a way that will embed racial equity in our climate decision making and into the just energy transition. Again, being very intentional about the role of voices in being involved, but also we have to make sure that the people that are affected are actually involved in the crafting of these delivery systems, right? That will create jobs and opportunities for the resources that are required to create these opportunities for folks. So, for example, we received some dollars from the NBA Foundation to actually develop a green jobs agenda in Atlanta, but this is what we're really excited about. We're actually leveraging our youth power building arm, yes, for equity, to give youth an opportunity to help design the approach and the mechanism by which young people, so it's a youth-centered and advanced and led green jobs agenda, right? And so again, we have to be very intentional about who is leading the work, and I think that the more we allow people who usually are left behind and not at the table, genius will realize itself if we allow people. I always say, and I always tell my staff, the people that are closest to the problem are actually closest to the solution. We just have to give them an opportunity to share their genius in order for us to be successful.
We're almost out of time. I want to ask one last question to the panel. If you look out 5 years, what is the ideal scenario? Like, where do you see the world in 5 years, and what is the first step to get to that point of this like near-term ideal? No, we're going down the row. You first.
I see the world in 5 years far more connected than it probably will be even now. in ways that I don't think we've fully vetted out. So, before the pandemic, all these interesting things going on, scooters, all these things. So there's just going to be another wave of that's going to kind of hit us. And I think in a good way if we approach it thoughtfully. And then I think the first step to that is really, really thinking about our public space again. And now, as most everything is kind of lifted, we're out and about. How do we interact? That's going to be a very important kind of foundation for many of these other things that we're building.
Yeah, I think, John, to answer that question, I have to look in the past 1 year. And the reason I said it is because I think what I'm going to say, the pandemic really influenced what I think about. I think 5 years from now, we're going to see a further movement of people away from large cities. You're going to see a lot of smaller cities being populated. You're going to see a lot of talent from those cities, because when a person moves from a big city and they have the idea, they have a company, they're taking the idea with them. And that company may be in that city. So I think we're going to see this whole growth of a lot of smaller towns. They're going to have technology companies that are there, especially on the climate side, on the environmental side, to be able to export some of that technology, not just here in the United States, but abroad. And I think that's going to fundamentally change a lot of things that we look at. That's why, for me, rural infrastructure is extremely important. That's why when I talk about geographic diversity, I'm looking at how we're doing it. And this idea of these jobs, I think we're going to have a lot of job portability that's going to happen in 5 years from now as well.
I would say that the same way that the South has been ground zero for the future of our democracy, I think that in 5 years, the South will become the center of the clean energy transition conversation because of the various climate challenges that we're facing, and also even in terms of the cost of utilities. It's going to become ground zero for those places. And I also believe that as a result of that, new voices will emerge that will be a lot more effective in making the case for why the optimization of profit must not be the primary driver for our clean energy transition, right? I'm tired of making the business case, right? We need to begin to go back and be comfortable with making the moral case for why we need to move forward. And for some people, they may not be comfortable with that, but I think that because of the social challenges that we're going to face, that it doesn't matter how much money you have if we're all not here. Right. So we got to find a way to live together. And I think that this gives us an opportunity to come together.
I would say that this is probably the one instance where the moral case and the business case are pretty tightly aligned.
That's right.
I mean, I really don't see a difference between the moral argument for this and the economic argument for this. There's going to be $9 trillion that's going to get spent every year around the world to make sure this energy transition happens, right? And it has to be spent, otherwise we're not going to hit the targets we need to hit, and then we're just going to be spending it in other ways on rebuilding infrastructure that's completely decimated every 5 to 10 years. You talk about me throwing around y'all's a lot. I grew up in Louisiana. If there's any place that knows about being climate challenged other than Miami and California, it's Louisiana. We get it almost every year, one way or another, and it, the consequences of this are dire, right? Yeah. And there's an opportunity though within that, I think, for cities to reinvent themselves, not just large cities like Los Angeles, but really medium-sized cities, small cities, towns. Like you're saying, this economic opportunity is going to be distributed pretty broadly because it's an entire transition of industry that needs to happen to address sustainability in the way that it needs to be addressed. Wow, that was a rant. Sorry about that, y'all. I feel like we are out of time. I really appreciate y'all sitting around. I hope we addressed some of y'all's questions, and now we have a just transition. We've done it. Yeah, it's done.
Absolutely.
All done. All right, thank y'all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.